Welcome to the UDL Principles and Instructional Design 3-part mini podcast series with Amanda, Ivy, Gabby, and Jordan. Throughout this mini episode, we share our thoughts and opinions on Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing and how we can relate that to instructional design.
What similarities exist between Indigenous ways of learning and universal design learning, or universal design for learning?
Keeping an open dialogue the entire time, being able to speak on how you feel in the moment. And
an article that I found talked about how UDL relates to the medicine wheel also, and that is on social and emotional learning. So kind of integrating learning, lecture-based, typical ways of learning to learning how to be aware of your own strengths, and then also utilizing those strengths to develop resilience too. So
meeting people where they're at and focusing on accessibility. And I think that's very similar to the UDO principles. It's focusing on everyone's needs and focusing on their emotions and their needs. So
it's focusing on everyone's needs was the big thing for me as well, and viewing it as a collaborative learning environment where everyone comes together to support everyone. That was the big thing, was support for me, because it when in the podcast that Gab was just talking about, talking about how Indigenous culture, it's very collaborative and supportive, and they want you to learn together. And especially with the use of oral language, where they're giving you the whole experience, where they don't really force you to learn one sort of way. It's any way that you can take in that knowledge.
And Amanda, I definitely felt that in our facilitating social innovation class, especially in the way that we facilitate the icebreakers, because everyone's on the same level, but at the same time, everyone has something valuable to contribute. So it's very much like you mentioned, a community of thought. And
where can land-based pedagogy be integrated in our information design education? And is there a place for it at all?
I feel like it's going to be such a big topic in the near future. I mean, it already is right now with climate change and stuff, but I think as we get older and it becomes even more of a crisis, more than it is right now, I think we're going to have to bring that in more and more, because that's going to be the forefront of conversation, because that's the life we're going to be living in the future, more than we already are. Even with the fires in Kelowna and stuff, if you even think of what maybe designers and marketing teams are doing down there for the fires and stuff like that, I feel you have to take into account they're probably going out and talking to Indigenous communities and stuff about what their thoughts on this and the land that their ancestors used to live, and how that compares to now.
That's a really cool way of looking at it, because I actually went for a broader way, but yeah, I think with information design, we are going to solve solutions. We are problem solvers, and to take in what the land is telling us, we get so much information from that.
Taking in the land, I love that, Amanda, because it's really talking about developing a holistic type of learning environment. It's not just the traditional ways of learning, a lecture stands at the beginning of a class. It's focusing on your physical health, emotional, as well as spiritual too, and then connecting that to the land, because we are all connected to the land in some sort of way, and in many ways, every facet of our lives. So yeah, I really like that, taking in the land, but also being cognizant of our audience, because our audience is not always humans. It's also the land that we live on too.
It's really important, because it's also important for us to go back to our roots and focusing on these connections between us and the land. So it's something that could be integrated in the information design.
I really like the making our land our audience too. That's kind of goes with the one class I'm in right now with the Land of Dreams project we're working on, and how we're going to present that or do something for them. We're still kind of working on it, but it just is, I don't know, it's really interesting to me. So I think like like when I was like going through all this stuff, it's like very something like I worry about a lot, like get like environmental anxiety, just the thoughts. But then like you hear like Indigenous people talk about the land, it makes you feel a little better because you're like, there always is that knowledge from them that you can go back and you can talk to them about it. It makes you kind of feel like ease because they're almost like, I mean, they don't call themselves experts from what I like gathered from like listening to this, but like they just have so much knowledge that they can like, I feel like help companies that I feel like they're going to be very, very important in the future when like huge companies realize, oh, we're kind of like messing up the world right now. And we need like, how do we live sustainably with the land, but also create good lives for everyone around us?
Do you feel like that's gonna be the case in the future? Like, do you have optimism that, because I would argue that they're doing that now. Like they're trying to tell us like we're in a problem. Like you should not be like fracking.
Yeah.
You should not be, you know, like the deforestation that's happening in BC, like those kind of things.
Yeah.
And do you think that like that'll change in the future, that we'll start listening to them, or they'll?
It's like we're in dire need, I think, because like if you see with COVID, we didn't do anything about it until like it was like the brink of like everything going to like just going crazy, and like no one started doing that, like no one was prepared, like no masks, nothing, like no one was ready for this. You even see this with ICU beds right now, like not prepared for this. So I feel like, yeah, 100% it's not gonna happen until like we're literally like die because we have like no food, no water, no way to like sustain the lives we're living.
Yeah, that's a great point, Amanda. Even the fact that you're like questioning too, like will it actually go forward even if we have like our best intentions in it, right? Because there absolutely is space for it, because Indigenous people were native to the land and they knew how to take care of it for generations and generations to come. But seeing how destructive we've become to the land, it's really disheartening. And I really hope that in the future, like it is integrated into our learning and especially like our living day in, day out. But yeah, that's really nice to question. Like, will it fall through?
Does the environment, classroom, labs, somewhere else affect a person's learning experience, and how does that content subject being taught come into play with the learning environments? I think if anything, this past year has definitely shown a lot of us that, you know, I do not learn well at home, or I can't focus at home. And those kind of environments, like where you take in information is really important. Like when I first read this question, I was thinking about this at like when I was in elementary school. I remember doing like science class. We'd go and walk around the park and collect, you know, trees and branches in like grade 1 or whatever, and you're being a part of the environment and taking like learning from hands-on experience. And especially when you're a kid, like that's the best way to learn, because you don't have a very strong understanding of the world yet, right? You may not have experienced or seen some of these things for the first time. So
there's a big difference in like learning inside of the classroom in like in an enclosed space, and like learning through like textbook knowledge, and like going somewhere and like having living experiences of the place and like the culture. And I think like the having that experience in somewhere, living it, I think that's more like efficient way to learn. Because like in a classroom environment, you tend to just like go to this like monotonous type of learning. Like you absorb like information from like textbooks and like lectures, and just like there's a tendency for it to like slip off your mind after like exams, or I don't know, like today when you learn something and then like it's just gonna fly away from your mind like a few weeks or months from now. So I think that's something that's important. I think we should like combine both, like having that like classroom environment and like living experiences to make more like learning more efficient, I guess. So there's like a combination of like textbook learning and like learning through experiences and like cultures. So yeah.
I agree with that like 100%. I find in the classroom I can't learn it all, but if I'm like in my like little area I've created for myself, or this is the only area where I like go to actually like study or work on stuff, then I learn so much better. I also thinking about like a few like 3 years ago I was in Glenn's class in second year, and we did like a thing where we went to this old folks home down in like Mount Royal, like where the old Mount Royal University used to be. And like I remember that whole experience because we were like there, we were learning there, like from the people. Like I was talking to this like older lady because I was assigned her and I was supposed to write like a whole thing. It all ended up kind of like falling through. But like in the moment, like when it was happening before like everything kind of went to whatever, I feel like I learned so much from this lady and just talking to her in like in a different setting and environment that I was taking it all in, and it's like one of the things in my mind that always sticks there that I never have forgotten. But like everything else that I learned in the classroom, besides like maybe doing the mouse traps with Gil in my first year, is like I do not remember much else. Like I don't. If it's like hands-on, like Amanda was saying, then yeah, I'll remember it. Or if it's in like an environment where like the learning is like facilitated for what you were like, it's directed and focused on integrated. I don't know how to explain that, but that like I find always helps the most. Sticks in your mind the most.
Environment in terms of like settings. So Amanda, when you brought up online learning versus in person, it didn't occur to me because I was going through the exact same thing. Like I could not learn at home in my little studio because it was all just on mesh with each other, home and school. So I really love all the points that Gab, you brought up about like being in an immersed environment too. And Jordan, you like learning from other people. And I think that's kind of what resonates with like the environment affecting someone's learning experience. Because for myself, I grew up in BC, and we would go on field trips where we would stay in Squamish, which is like Indigenous land. And we learn from elders and the traditions around their own like legacies and how the way they treat the environment and food as well. So really being immersed in that kind of like affected me in a good way when I grew up and learned how to bring that into my like learning as well, in terms of how I approach Indigenous learning as well, because I've been immersed in that kind of environment. And then also in the short film too, I really loved how they described like where you are geographically affects your approach to learning, because say people that lived in Colorado see mountains as opportunity to mine for resources, whereas in Peru they see it as like a sacred deity which should always be protected. So I find that really interesting how those contrasts play out too.
Gab, I really appreciated what you were saying about like how like the learning environments of bringing in the like for information design, especially like bringing in blending the two environments together of learning in person and getting a hands-on experience. And that's actually one, like for me, when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life and like pick out like a university program, one of the things that was really important to me was that I had an opportunity to do a practicum or like a work experience, because I struggle so hard to take what I learn in class into a real life situation. And for me, like having that opportunity, like it's not quite the same, but it's, having that work experience to bring in those learning, the skills that you've learned in a traditional learning environment is just one of the things that was important for me to be able to enhance my learning.
So like a good opportunity, like having that like a work experience that we have, like the work practicum. So like we could like apply our learning in a real world environment. So then in that environment, like in the work environment, you actually learn as well, like how things go inside of the workplace, so you are aware. Because like they do teach us how to like do resumes and like doing interviews and like portfolios, but they don't really like teach us how things are inside of the workplace. So being in that workplace brings in the opportunity to learn about that. So
kind of transitions quite well into the next question of how can we integrate Indigenous ways of knowing and learning into our information design program. What Jordan was saying about the going to a senior's home and getting that hands-on experience, like that is like a great example of how I think we can integrate you know, Indigenous knowing and learning processes.
Yeah, all of this was like a really good segue into this question, because the podcast even delves into why we value things like our physical health, and it really talks about like a holistic approach to learning, and that is a huge like lesson to learn, especially in this point of our degree, because our learning, like you said, Gabby, isn't just about the traditional ways of learning. It's also about blending your lived experience with your own lived experience that you've learned outside of school. So I think a way that we can integrate Indigenous ways of knowing and learning is adopting that mindset of you aren't always an expert, and being in that constant state of learning as well. But at the same time, also being cognizant of the lived experiences of others, because especially for Indigenous people, their struggles aren't always visible also. And it kind of plays into universal design, because we don't see intergenerational trauma, but we see the symptoms and the side effects of that. So seeing it as like a whole system as well kind of resonates with me.
You said that like we have to kind of go into it sometimes knowing that we're not like an expert, because I find like that's a huge thing in like the workplace, because I feel like I don't know, there's certain people that you come in and they're like kind of like they have no idea what they're doing, but they act like they know what you're doing. You're just like, what? And I feel like all learning comes from just like accepting that you don't know, and then you just, like go into that and you're like, okay, I don't know this, but I'm willing to learn. And like I feel like the best thing you can do in life is just continue to learn. Like just never stop learning. That's what you can do.
I discovered like in the Indigenous like cultures, they value like elders very much, and like the elders have these stories that only them could like tell other people, and they have a certain like level of wisdom that's well respected by everyone, as well as like women's and elders, and they're very like focused on like the roles of these women and like elders and stuff. So I think inside in our design degree, I think it's the similar way as we view like Ben, um, Brian, and like Gil, since they're like the ones with like the knowledge and stuff, and they teach us in a way that they tell us that their stories and like their experiences that encourages us to think in our own way. So I think like, that's the way I see like the similarities between that. So
Really value, especially when like, you know, Kelsey is really great for sharing personal stories about how she's learned in the past. Like for one of the classes I took with her last year, she was talking about like the things that she's learned from her contracts in the past. Like, oh, I would never do this again in my contract. Like, take it from me. Like that kind of advice is like so valuable because it's a lived experience that she's sharing, and she's like, I've made the mistakes. Like, you don't need to make it too. Like, and Kelsey obviously doesn't say it like that, which is refreshing too. But yeah, like that is such a great point, Gab, about how like profs that share that stuff have value. And I think that one of the nice things about our program too is that our cohorts are pretty like fairly close. Like we all like have our groups in our cohort, but we also like are very social, and there's a lot of learning that happens, especially when you're in person, like, and just discussing things. Like for Humanly, for example, like I am learning so much from my team because I have no marketing experience, and I was like, I want to be on this team so that I can just absorb all the knowledge that everyone has. And it's so awesome because like Tia was just like, oh yeah, like I've had really great success with this application, like this is really handy. And like it's just even like peer to peer, like just gaining that knowledge there as well.
You know, there's so much value in like just talking to people. I find almost more than any, like our degree provides so much learning and so much for us to learn, but like yeah, all of us coming together and actually talking about it, I feel like that's where you almost learn like the most, like because then you're getting experiences from all types of people and all different kind of experiences, because everyone goes through like different path on their route into our degree, that like no one is going to have the same set of skills. So like being able to talk to people about like certain things, like you were saying, Amanda, just like provides you with so much that you would have never known if you just kind of like stick to yourself when you're not willing to like talk to others. And that's like something I push myself to do, because I'm like, there's just so much value, and I've like learned just from like meeting so many people throughout this process that like just everyone has something of value that you can learn from them. And that's just how I feel like you gain knowledge and like wisdom over time. It's just like talking to people.
What do you think of colonization? What do you think colonization means in the context of higher education? And what are some ways that we can decolonize learning at MRU? The way I would describe it, it's like expecting everyone, colonization is expecting everyone to learn the same way and not have the options to expand their learning experiences to different modes. We're starting to see a shift in like our younger generation, especially with like Montessori schools becoming a huge thing of like hands-on learning and experiential learning.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how it's going to look like in post-secondary, but I think in like 10, 15 years, it's going to have a huge shift to adjust to the way that the upcoming generation's learning.
That's kind of how I felt, but I kind of wanted to bring up a point, because there's like, I was on TikTok and it was talking about like these different schools that are also coming up. I'm not sure if they're called the Montessori ones or what they are, but like it was just talking about how these schools like are more really like catered more to like Indigenous practices and stuff. And then so basically you're all together, like K to 12, you're thrown all together, and you get to pick what you want to do, like gardening, horseback riding, sports, like art, being creative. Like you pick what you want to do. And it's so funny because sports was like rarely picked, but like gardening and learning how to do stuff with like plants was like the thing you wanted to do. Like if you were in sports, you were not popular, like at all. But then there was also like not the hierarchy either. Like you didn't have the hierarchy you see like in universities and stuff. I like found that really interesting when I came across that TikTok, because I was like, it wipes away all that, and people can just like be, and they can enjoy what makes them happy. And I might be off on a tangent, but I just had to share that, because I thought that was like the coolest thing ever. Because I was like, could you imagine growing up in like a system where you didn't feel the pressure to be like a certain type of person based on like popularity? Like that would have made me such a different person in like high school, and like I wouldn't have been so shy maybe, or maybe I would even had like social anxiety in like elementary and upwards till now, if we never had that like hierarchy among people. In Indigenous culture, you would just like all together, you're one, you're like on the same level, and everyone accepts for whatever knowledge point you have is just more knowledge and wisdom you can give to other people.
Really resonate, Jordan, with the fact that going with enjoying what makes you happy, because we're like, of course we can think about elementary school where we were set on learning like these like set outcomes, and that's like if you did anything else you were, I don't know, like off in your own world, or you just weren't getting it. But really in terms with the fact that all kids learn the same, even as adults we learn differently in university, so being cognizant of that is super important. And imposter syndrome too, because I felt it quite a bit in my first internship, and even now as a fourth year student I'm like, I should be able to speak in front of a class comfortably, or I should be comfortable with these design programs. But I read an article from the Harvard Business Review about how imposter syndrome in minorities kind of shows itself in like a different way, because minorities aren't built for like the hierarchical stereotypes of workplace and school. So that's why it almost like evokes, like it almost manifests in like a different way in minorities, because we aren't made for this world for the white men. So it almost like, I almost internalize it in a way. And I don't know if that makes sense, but I can go off about in the short film, seeing those illustrations about the American progress, like the white woman, like almost gliding over the land like she owns it. And I, like, even right now speaking about it, I felt such a visceral reaction of just discomfort and like a gut, like a gross gut feeling, because it has that like white savior kind of complex. And here, let me preach my Christian values onto you, and everything that you do and everything that you practice is wrong. So even like as a Filipino minority, like I resonate with the colonialism in the Philippines too, and also seeing the story of people in Tibet resonated with me, because my partner's from Tibet too. So seeing that they do like the traditional ways of learning from Buddhist teachings, and how it's almost like assimilating into like Eurocentric kind of learning. Like everyone moves away from their small towns and like aspires to be a doctor or an engineer, but in reality, those rural cities are losing their sense of culture. So I just really connected with that.
Yeah, that's the thing that stuck to me from like the documentary, like the colonization part. I think it has to be from like the intent of like learning of higher education. From the documentary, it's like it's telling us like education is like a one agenda, like training people and like learning to serve the economy. Basically, it's like most of us are like focused on like breaking into the third world and like um, being on top and like being successful in that so that we can earn like more money and stuff, that it makes us lose our like individuality almost. And like we're straying away from like our self in a way, since we're so focused on like the modern part of our world kind of.
No, I find that like so interesting, because I feel like you see like this like white savior complex a lot.
I think with the addition of social media, it's just exasperated that stuff. Like, where it's like, are you doing it for the movement or are you doing it for social media? Like, sorry if you guys were a part of this, but the black squares for Black Lives Matter on social media was like very performative in my opinion, and it didn't really move anything. And it was just like doing something for the sake of, because that's what social media was doing.
Yeah.
So I struggled with that, like the performative aspect of that.
For sure, the performative as well as like the discomfort.
I love like having these discussions, because I think it's like such a great opportunity for growth and like self-reflection. So does anyone else have anything to add to that?
I just had a thought as well about the decolonizing piece. So I think a way that we can decolonize learning at MRU is even decolonizing mental health and really pushing resources for minorities and almost like personalizing it in a way, because minorities deal with so much intergenerational trauma and racism that we face day in, day out that we can't quite process. And I think that mental health piece is super important because in our cultures, mental health isn't even talked about or even processed in a healthier way. So I think a way that we can decolonize learning at MRU is through mental health first and foremost.
In the process of learning or coming to know something, how does Western education view this process versus Indigenous ways of learning?
My learning theory compendium was actually Maslow's hierarchy, which we all know of, but Blackfoot origin. So Maslow kind of asked, how do we become self-actualized? Whereas Blackfoot culture sees it as we are already inherently, they wouldn't even use the word self-actualized. I'm not quite sure what the term would be, but almost knowing that it's innate versus earned. And the best way I can put this is, as we're going through university, we earn a degree by paying tuition, attending classes, and then proving that you're sufficient in your mastery in your study. Whereas in Blackfoot culture, you're already credentialed and you spend your life living up to that. So I think seeing them as, like, I really love that way of knowing by relating people to like inherently wise is really humbling, because we spend our lives preparing ourselves for a culture that's so work-based and like go versus cultures that see you for you and giving you the space to express who you are versus always trying to achieve that, if that makes sense.
So many like books and stuff sold to us that like leads you to this path of self-actualization, but like if you can like actually believe in yourself that you already like are, you just need to like accept it almost. I feel like that's just, it's exactly what you said, Aggie. It's like a humbling experience just to know that like it, I don't know, it gives you, I feel like, more of a sense of confidence in yourself that you like, you already have it in you. You just need to like pull it out. Versus like, I need to strive for this. I always need to work for this. I need to try and get, but that's like kind of like the society we live in. You always are working towards something. Always. There's always something there. Like once you get something, there's another thing. And I was like thinking about that when I was listening to these podcasts and everything. I'm like, we just always live in a world where we're striving for something new, something better. And like, why can't we just sit with what is and be happy with what is when we like to feel just like confident and comfortable with ourselves, like just feeling at ease in that?
I really struggle with that because I feel like lately I almost guilt myself for resting. And I saw an Instagram post saying that like, if we're not always improving ourselves or like working on our skills to market ourselves, then we're somewhat worthless. And that's exactly how I feel about it. And really coming to terms with the fact that I need to like our bodies need to rest. It's normal, and we don't always have to keep moving forward and looking for ways to market ourselves for work. Like, and really prioritizing rest versus always striving for that.
Writing this down, if we always keep working on ourselves, like trying to better ourselves, like, and then we're worthless. Because I've seen like a ton of TikToks on this topic as well, of like not just education or like bettering our skills, but bettering ourselves as like people. And like I have spent so much of COVID just self-reflecting like, oh my gosh, these are all the things that I don't like about myself, like these are the things I want to fix. And it's exhausting. Like I need to just like appreciate, you know, and take a moment and like stop and appreciate the work that I've done instead of like, you know, being like, oh, there's so much more I need to do, and like I'm so worthless, I gotta do all this stuff. That's so interesting. Thanks, Ivy.
It's like, in a way, it's about like having this perspective of like looking at the glass like half full instead of like half empty. I think like us, like we have like a tendency to like always chasing of like filling that cup, and like always like pushing further and like achieving and like doing, just so we can feel in ourselves like, oh, I'm good enough.
That's like
But
validation.
in reality, in reality, we are already good enough as is. We just have to like accept that in a way.
Yeah.
And I do agree like with what Jordan says. Like there's like this sense of like ease and um like you're something like calm or something, knowing that, oh, I'm already good enough, instead of like beating yourself up and stuff.
Self-worth, and it's not just education. Like you're trying to improve, build on these skills, and it's like, what if I just accept that I am who I am and I'm going to grow? And it's not a tiered system. It's a more holistic system where I'm going to learn as I go. And it's not like,
Tie in with the previous question, because Western education is so focused on proving your mastery. Like you only know like a sufficient amount of information once you have a PhD, things like that, like really material credentials. Whereas Indigenous ways of learning are focused on like learning experiences, and like you're always in a constant like state of learning. Like we said, like you never know everything. And I think being open to those different opinions and making space for everyone is super important.
The tie to Western education and capitalism, like to become an expert, you have to put all this money, and the barriers that creates, like it's discrimination against social classes. Like sure, there's programs available, but you have to go through so many hoops, and so and then you tie in the colonization of everything, and it's like, well, that's why you have that, because those barriers exist, because we have been, the Western culture is so focused on, you need to get this piece of paper in order to be able to get the job that you want or whatever.
It's like the sense of like hierarchy in like the Western education, like the Western world is just so prominent that it's just kind of frustrating almost. But like in like the Indigenous ways of learning, it's more about like you and like other people and like being open and like engaging with everyone.
And I don't know, it's also, it comes back to like gender too with all this stuff, and like Indigenous practices, women are like seen as equals.
Yeah.
And like still in the society we live in, there is like that difference in gender. And yeah, I don't know, which is so interesting, because yeah, like if I like came back because I was like, my worth is definitely tied to the level of education I have right now as a woman, and like I have to connect that, because that's the society we live in, and I have to like get this education, or else like I can't serve for the rest of my life and like provide. And I can try as hard as I can, but there will always be that, like there will be certain barriers to how much I can achieve based on being a woman.
Sentiment is something that I think, like I know that I've heard, because throughout my life, of you need an education in order to get a good job. And I've never thought of it from the perspective of me being a woman, but because that was one of the questions I was going to ask you guys, is like, how many people do you guys have you heard of that have gotten like a job? I can think of one person that has gotten a career based off their education. They didn't have education, they were coding as well. And when you were talking, I was like, oh my gosh, he's a man. So would that happen for women? I don't know, because like that's, it's just one of those things.
The common theme here is like that heteronormativity too, like that it's always been white males, or at least like heterosexual males in that position. So like even Amanda, you had that like epitome of like, oh yeah, like the person in the position was a male, like, and really becoming aware of how our society is built for men and not to include us. So
And like the juxtaposition between like the Western world, like with this like male dominant like society, and like in the indigenous like culture where women are like viewed as really like in more ways than in the Western world. It's just interesting to look at.
In recording and communicating knowledge, how does the value of written language compare to oral language in Western society? And then how does that compare to Indigenous cultures?
or Western cultures value written language over oral, whereas Indigenous culture is vice versa. So I found that really interesting because oral learning can't necessarily be documented. So they might discredit their oral language, whereas Indigenous cultures, like that's how they pass knowledge down through generations, is through oral language. And it related to the fact that languages, like Indigenous languages, are being lost. And that's really heartbreaking because all those like lived experiences are being lost through the cracks. And it really relates to colonialism as a whole. And this entire call relates to colonialism and how it's erasing cultures to make it palatable for the male like population. I listened to another UDL podcast where she couldn't quite articulate how to describe their connection to sound, but she made this kind of sound with her hands. Right? Do you remember that? And it related to like the sound shush or like shh. So I think like that connecting emotions to learning and sound is completely different to like say a written paper.
I feel like I value like oral conversation versus anything written. I way rather listen to a podcast than read about it because I just feel like there's so much more to gain from listening, especially like what you said, Ivy, with like emotions and like sound and stuff. There's just something, I don't know, it just sticks in my mind so much more. And I feel like I gain so much more from listening to people speak. And I feel like that's why like shows and stuff are so like prevalent.
Thinking about this question, I was like, how do I learn? Like, if I had to pick oral or written, what would I prefer? And I was like, oh, written, because when I'm talking to people, my brain, like, I recently discovered that I have ADHD, and so when I'm talking to people, my brain is just like going through the Rolodex of other things that I'm thinking about, and I am terrible for focusing on the moment. But so I was like, I was leaning towards writing, but then I was thinking about it, and for me, I actually think that I learned best from oral because written, I don't intake that knowledge. I read it and now I know where it is. Like if I need to review it, I can go back to it. So I don't really intake the information. I intake where that information can be found in the future. Whereas when people are telling me like the process for what to do or like how to do something, and we're having a conversation, and especially if I can do it in person and we can like learn with like another property where it's like hands-on learning or something like that, I retain that knowledge so much better because there's that personal touch and the ability, like I know that this is a once, like this is the time I'm learning. I'm not going to be able to replay this moment in my life like later on. So I intake it a bit more.
Same kind of thought as well. I think because like in conversations and like in like oral language, I think there's a more like humanistic approach to learning and like retaining information compared to like written like language. And like when you read something, I agree with Amanda, like you read it and then like you store it somewhere in your brain, and then you can like go back to that or like review the written document and like know where to find that information. But like when you retain information through like conversations or like oral language, it just sticks in your brain even more. you just remember it like more efficiently than like written. Because like for me, when I read something, I tend to like sometimes lose my focus and like drift. My mind is like drifting somewhere, so it's kind of like it's a bit hard for me to learn that way. Compared to us like having these conversations with, it's more efficient for me to like retain like the information and like the ideas and our concepts and like our different perspectives. So
another way that resonated with me for Indigenous oral language is the way they drum. So on Canada Day, I saw some Indigenous people drumming in honor of the residential school children. And you could feel the vibrations of the drumming with your heart. And it's kind of like apparently the sounds are supposed to resemble heartbeats, as well as like the sounds are based on animals too. So there's also that connection to the environment versus written, where you would never feel that kind of visceral feeling.
The examples that I had come up with earlier was like when I read a book, if I read 5 or 6 books in a day, like in a year, I will not be able to remember the full storyline in that book. But if I have a conversation with you, like 10 years ago, I could tell you somebody's story, like that they had an orange juice box on their first day of class or something that stuck with them, a story that they told me. And like those, it just shows you the impact that an oral learning environment has over written. Like, you just are able to take in things and with like just suck it in, and for some reason it sticks way better in my mind when people tell me their stories rather than reading about their stories.
We're almost like, I think there's like a theory on this that we're still like, some of us are still stuck in like the what is it called, the hunter-gatherer like mind still, and some of us have moved on to like a modern style brain. Like there's like an actual theory on that where some of us, that's why we get like depressed and anxious and stuff, is because we're still stuck in that mindset. So like if you think about it, that's probably why we like love like connection with people, and why like oral conversation just sticks with us, because that's how we lived for so long. And now we're in such a different society where it's like texting or emailing or reading or blah blah blah. So it's just like our brains can't fully take that in.
I think that's also like a sign of the times too, is that we are so overloaded with like text, like you're getting those texts and it's all written and it's hard to absorb it all when you're